I'm Marcus. The day we buried Grandma Helen, nobody cried. Not really. My Aunt Diane dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief while scanning the crowd like she was counting votes. My Uncle Gerald checked his watch 3 times during the eulogy. And my cousin Stephanie, she spent the entire service staring at Grandma's casket with the kind of focus a jeweler gives to diamonds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They were all waiting for the same thing. The emerald ring. The one Grandma wore every single day for 47 years. The one that supposedly carried a curse, a blessing, and enough family legend to fill a memoir nobody would believe. But here's what they didn't know. While they were sharpening their claws over a piece of jewelry, I was standing there with something far more valuable folded inside my jacket pocket. A document Grandma had pressed into my hands 3 weeks earlier, her fingers cold and trembling, her voice barely a whisper. She made me promise not to open it until after the service. And she made me promise something else too. Don't let them see you coming. The chapel smelled like lilies and expensive perfume, the kind that announces wealth before the wearer even speaks. I stood in the back row, hands folded, watching the performance unfold. Grandma Helen's mahogany casket sat beneath a spray of white roses, flanked by photographs from her younger years. In every single one, she wore that ring. Stephanie was the first to break. The moment Reverend Michaels finished his closing prayer, she stood abruptly, heels clicking against the marble floor as she marched straight to the funeral director. I need to speak with you about my grandmother's personal effects, she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Specifically, her jewelry. The director, a thin man with sympathetic eyes and practiced patience, glanced toward my aunt. I believe those arrangements were handled by the family representative. Diane rose smoothly, straightening her black Chanel jacket. That would be me. I'm the eldest daughter. All personal items will be inventoried and distributed according to the will. There is no will, Gerald cut in, stepping forward with his lawyer swagger. Ma never filed anything with probate. Which means everything defaults to equal distribution among the children. I watched from my position near the doorway, saying nothing. The document in my pocket felt heavier with every word they spoke. Stephanie's voice climbed an octave. That ring was promised to me. Grandma told me herself last Christmas that I would have it. Diane's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Funny, she told me the exact same thing at Easter. The funeral director raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Perhaps we should table this discussion for a more appropriate time and place. No, Gerald said flatly. We settle this now. That ring is worth at least $200,000. We're not leaving here without knowing who has claim to it. I felt my jaw tighten. 200,000. They had already appraised it. Probably had buyers lined up. Grandma wasn't even in the ground yet, and they were dividing her up like assets in a bankruptcy. The director cleared his throat. I'm afraid the ring isn't here. Mrs. Castellano's body was prepared according to her written instructions. The ring was not among the items we received. The room went silent. Stephanie's face drained of color. Diane's eyes narrowed to slits. Gerald pulled out his phone like he was about to call the police. What do you mean it's not here? Diane's voice dropped to something dangerous. Where is it? I couldn't tell you, ma'am. You'd have to speak with whoever handled her affairs before she passed. All 3 of them turned, almost in unison, and looked directly at me. I kept my expression neutral, hands still folded, posture relaxed. I had learned a long time ago that silence made people nervous. And nervous people made mistakes. Marcus, Diane said, walking toward me with measured steps. You were with her the most during those final weeks. Do you know anything about the ring? I met her gaze without flinching. She wore it every day. You know that. That's not what I asked. Gerald moved closer, blocking the aisle. Let's not play games, kid. If you know where it is, now's the time to speak up. I'm not playing anything, I said quietly. I was there to take care of her. Not inventory her jewelry. Stephanie crossed her arms, eyes blazing. You always were her favorite. What did she give you? What did she promise you? Nothing, I lied. And it was a lie, but one I had no intention of correcting. Not here. Not yet. The funeral director interjected again, more firmly this time. Ladies, gentlemen, please. This is neither the time nor the place. I suggest you reconvene with the estate attorney next week. Diane didn't move. She kept staring at me like she could peel back my skin and see the truth underneath. Fine. Next week. But Marcus, if you're hiding something, we will find out. I'm not hiding anything, I said. Then I turned and walked out of the chapel into the cold October air. The cemetery was 2 miles away, a sprawling hillside dotted with oak trees and granite headstones worn smooth by decades of rain. I drove there alone, windows down, letting the wind clear my head. By the time I arrived, the funeral procession had already begun. Black cars lined the narrow road, engines idling, exhaust curling into the gray sky. I parked at the far end and walked up the hill to where Grandma's plot waited, freshly dug, surrounded by green tarps that tried and failed to make death look dignified. Diane stood at the head of the grave, Gerald beside her, Stephanie clutching a single white rose like it was a prop in a stage play. A handful of Grandma's friends from church filled in the gaps, faces I recognized from years of Sunday dinners and holiday parties. I took my place at the edge of the group, far enough to avoid conversation, close enough to hear the Reverend's words. He spoke about Helen Castellano's generosity, her faith, her devotion to family. He mentioned her late husband, my grandfather Vincent, who had passed 12 years earlier. He talked about legacy and love and eternal rest. None of it felt real. Not because it wasn't true, but because the people standing around that grave didn't care about any of it. They cared about money. About the ring. About what they thought they were owed. As the casket was lowered into the earth, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the folded edges of the envelope Grandma had given me. My name was written across the front in her shaky cursive. Marcus Anthony Castellano. Private. I thought about opening it right there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe I just wanted one more moment before everything changed. The service ended. People began to drift away, murmuring condolences to one another, heading back to their cars. I stayed where I was, watching the groundskeepers begin their work, shoveling dirt onto the casket with rhythmic, practiced efficiency. Diane approached from behind, her voice low and controlled. We need to talk. I didn't turn around. About what? About what happens next. Gerald's already contacted a probate attorney. If there's no will, the estate gets divided equally among the three of us. You'll get a share too, obviously, but the house, the accounts, the valuables, all of that needs to be assessed and liquidated. Liquidated, I repeated. You mean sold? It's the cleanest way. We can't all live in that house, Marcus. And frankly, none of us want to. I finally turned to face her. Grandma lived in that house for 53 years. And now she's gone. We have to be practical. Practical, I said. Right. Gerald joined us, hands in his pockets, his expression all business. We're meeting with the lawyer on Thursday. 10 a.m. You should be there. I will be. Good. And Marcus, if you know anything about that ring, anything at all, you need to disclose it. Hiding assets during probate is a felony. I'm not hiding anything, I said again, and this time I almost believed it myself. They walked away together, heads bent in conversation, already strategizing their next move. Stephanie lingered near her car, watching me with suspicion, but eventually she left too. When the last car disappeared down the hill, I pulled out the envelope. My hands were steadier than I expected. I broke the seal carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. It wasn't a letter. It was a legal document. Last will and testament of Helen Marie Castellano. Signed, dated, notarized. Witnessed by 2 people I didn't recognize. I scanned the contents quickly, my heart pounding harder with every line. She had left the house to a local charity. The savings accounts were divided among her church and a scholarship fund she had quietly established years ago. Her personal belongings, furniture, photographs, were to be donated or distributed to friends. And then, at the bottom, a single paragraph. To my grandson, Marcus Anthony Castellano, I leave the entirety of my investment portfolio, held in trust under account number ending in 7743, as well as all documents pertaining to the Castellano family estate, to be administered at his sole discretion. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it carefully in my pocket. The investment portfolio. I didn't even know she had one. Grandma had lived modestly, drove a 15-year-old sedan, clipped coupons, bought store-brand groceries. She had never mentioned stocks, bonds, or anything beyond her small pension and Social Security. But clearly, there was more. And she had made sure I was the only one who knew. I walked back to my car slowly, my mind racing. Thursday's meeting was going to be interesting. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd had with Grandma over the past 6 months. She had asked me to visit more often. To help with groceries, with bills, with the small tasks that became monumental when your body started failing. I had said yes without hesitation. Not because I expected anything in return, but because she was the only person in my family who had ever treated me like I mattered. My mother had died when I was 8. Cancer, sudden and merciless. My father remarried within a year, moved across the country, started a new family. I became an afterthought, a name on a Christmas card, a phone call on birthdays that came later and later until they stopped altogether. Grandma Helen was the one who showed up. She took me in during summers, taught me to cook, to balance a checkbook, to fix a leaking faucet. She never made me feel like a burden. Never made me feel like I was less than. And when I graduated high school with no money for college, she was the one who handed me an envelope with a check inside. Not a loan. A gift. Enough to cover my first semester at community college. I had tried to refuse. She insisted. And when I finally accepted, she made me promise one thing. Don't waste it. And don't forget where you came from. I kept that promise. I worked 2 jobs, finished my degree, started a career in accounting. I visited her every weekend, brought groceries, fixed whatever needed fixing. I didn't do it for inheritance. I did it because she had done it for me. But Diane, Gerald, Stephanie, they had barely called. Barely visited. They showed up on holidays with expensive wine and empty conversation, took photos for social media, then disappeared until the next occasion required their presence. And now they wanted everything. Thursday morning arrived cold and overcast. I wore a gray suit, simple and unremarkable, the kind that didn't draw attention. I arrived at the law office 10 minutes early and waited in the lobby, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading. Diane swept in at exactly 10, Gerald right behind her, Stephanie trailing with a designer handbag that probably cost more than my rent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They acknowledged me with curt nods and took seats across the room. At 10:05, a paralegal escorted us into a conference room where a silver-haired attorney named Richard Drummond waited, files stacked neatly in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone professional and detached. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding Mrs. Castellano's estate." "Confusion is one word for it," Gerald said. "We were told there's no will on file." Drummond nodded. "That's correct. There is no will filed with the probate court." Diane leaned forward. "So we proceed with intestate succession. Equal distribution among the children." "Not exactly," Drummond said. He opened the top file. "I've been contacted by another party who claims to possess a valid will executed by Mrs. Castellano. The room went still. Stephanie's eyes widened. Gerald's jaw clenched. Diane's expression turned glacial. "Who?" she demanded. I raised my hand slightly. "That would be me." 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me with the intensity of searchlights. "You?" Gerald's voice was sharp. "You have a will?" I pulled the envelope from my jacket and slid it across the table to Drummond. He examined it carefully, checking the signatures, the notarization, the date. "This appears to be legitimate," he said after a long moment. "Signed 3 weeks before Mrs. Castellano's death. Properly witnessed and notarized." Diane snatched it from his hands, her eyes scanning the document with increasing fury. "This is absurd. She left everything to charities? To strangers?" "And to Marcus," Gerald added, reading over her shoulder. "An investment portfolio." "What investment portfolio?" Drummond cleared his throat. "I've been provided with account documentation. The portfolio in question is valued at approximately $3.2 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie was the first to recover. "That's impossible. Grandma didn't have that kind of money." "Apparently, she did," Drummond said calmly. "The account was established in 1995 with funds from the sale of commercial property owned jointly with her late husband. It's been managed conservatively and has grown significantly over the years." Diane slammed the will onto the table. "This is fraud. He manipulated her." She was sick, confused, vulnerable. I spoke for the first time, my voice steady. "She was completely lucid when she signed that. The witnesses can confirm it." "Witnesses we've never heard of," Gerald shot back. "How convenient." Drummond interjected. "The witnesses are a nurse and a social worker, both employed by the hospice care facility Mrs. Castellano used. Their credentials are impeccable." Diane stood abruptly. "We're contesting this. All of it." "That's your right," Drummond said. "But I should warn you, contesting a properly executed will is expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful without substantial evidence of fraud or undue influence." "We'll find the evidence," Diane hissed. "And when we do, Marcus, you'll wish you'd never been born." She stormed out, Gerald and Stephanie following like soldiers behind a general. I remained seated, my hands folded on the table, my heart pounding but my face calm. Drummond looked at me with something like sympathy. "You should prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly." "I know," I said. "But I'm not giving it back." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be ready." Over the next 2 weeks, the attacks began. Diane hired a high-powered attorney known for breaking wills. Gerald started making calls, digging into my background, looking for anything they could use. Stephanie took to social media, posting vague messages about family betrayal and stolen legacies. I ignored all of it. Instead, I met with Drummond, reviewed every piece of documentation, prepared for the legal battle I knew was coming. And then, one evening, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind Grandma used to keep on her dresser. I opened it carefully. Inside was the emerald ring. Beneath it, a handwritten note in Grandma's shaky script. "They'll fight over this. Let them. You know what really matters." I held the ring up to the light, watching the way the stone caught and reflected the fading sun. It was beautiful, yes. Valuable, certainly. But it wasn't why she had chosen me. She had chosen me because I had shown up. Because I had cared when caring wasn't convenient. Because I had loved her not for what she could give me, but for who she was. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance. Not money. Not jewelry. But the knowledge that I had done right by someone who had done right by me. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Diane's legal team filed motion after motion, demanding financial records, medical evaluations, testimony from anyone who had contact with Grandma in her final months. Drummond fought back methodically, providing documentation for everything, demonstrating a clear pattern of Grandma's mental competency, showing that the will reflected her long-standing values and wishes. But the real turning point came when the hospice nurse, a woman named Caroline, agreed to testify. She arrived at the deposition in scrubs, just off a shift, her exhaustion evident but her resolve unshakable. Diane's attorney, a sharp-suited man named Brennan, wasted no time. "Ms. Morris, how well did you know Mrs. Castellano?" "Very well," Caroline said. "I cared for her during the final 3 months of her life." "And during that time, would you say her mental state was compromised?" Caroline didn't hesitate. "Not at all. She was sharp, articulate, and fully aware of her circumstances." Brennan leaned forward. "But she was on significant pain medication, wasn't she? Opioids can cause confusion, hallucinations, impaired judgment." "They can," Caroline agreed. "But Mrs. Castellano was on a very conservative dosage. She refused anything stronger because she wanted to remain clear-headed." Brennan pressed harder. "Isn't it possible that Mr. Castellano, who visited frequently, could have influenced her decisions?" Caroline's expression hardened. "I was present for many of those visits. Marcus brought groceries, read to her, helped with bills. He never once asked her for anything. In fact, she initiated every conversation about her estate. She was very specific about what she wanted." Brennan tried a different angle. "But you witnessed the will. Doesn't that strike you as unusual? Why would she ask medical staff to be witnesses instead of family?" "Because," Caroline said slowly, "she didn't trust her family to honor her wishes. She told me that herself." The room went silent. Brennan shuffled his papers, searching for another line of attack, but Caroline had already dismantled his case. When the deposition ended, Drummond caught my eye across the room and gave the slightest nod. We were winning. But Diane wasn't finished. 2 days before the hearing, she played her final card. A private investigator she had hired uncovered something from my past. A misdemeanor charge from when I was 19. I had been caught with a fake ID trying to buy alcohol. The charge had been dismissed after I completed a diversion program, expunged from my record. But Diane's team had found it. And they leaked it to a local news blog known for sensationalist stories. The headline read, "Grandson accused of manipulating dying woman has criminal past." The article was garbage, filled with insinuations and half-truths, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. My phone exploded with messages. Friends asking if it was true. Former coworkers expressing concern. Strangers sending hate mail. I wanted to disappear. To walk away from all of it. But then I remembered Grandma's words. "Don't let them see you coming." I called Drummond. "We need to respond." He agreed. Within hours, we released a statement clarifying the facts, providing documentation of the dismissed charge, and pointing out the desperation of Diane's tactics. But more importantly, we went on the offensive. Drummond's team had been quietly investigating Diane, Gerald, and Stephanie. And what they found was damning. Gerald had borrowed $50,000 from Grandma 6 years ago, promising to repay it within a year. He never had. The promissory note was sitting in Grandma's files, signed and dated. Stephanie had used Grandma's credit card without permission on 3 separate occasions, racking up charges for luxury purchases. Grandma had paid the bills but kept the statements. And Diane, the eldest, the self-appointed matriarch, had convinced Grandma to co-sign a loan for a business venture that collapsed within 6 months, leaving Grandma on the hook for $75,000. Grandma had never mentioned any of it. She had simply absorbed the losses, paid the debts, and said nothing. But she had kept the records. Every single one. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with a judge who looked like she had seen every trick in the book and had no patience for any of them. Diane sat on one side with her legal team, projecting confidence. I sat on the other with Drummond, my stomach twisted into knots. The judge reviewed the will, the medical records, the witness statements. She asked pointed questions about Grandma's mental state, the timing of the will, the nature of my relationship with her. Drummond answered each one with precision, laying out the facts methodically. Then Diane's attorney stood and began his argument. He painted me as a predator, someone who had isolated Grandma, manipulated her, turned her against her own children. He presented the news article about my past. He implied that I had undue influence. He demanded the will be set aside. When he finished, the judge turned to me. "Mr. Castellano, do you have anything to say?" I stood slowly. "Your Honor, I loved my grandmother. I took care of her because she took care of me when nobody else did. I didn't ask her for anything. She gave me this responsibility because she trusted me to honor her wishes. And that's all I'm trying to do." The judge studied me for a long moment. Then she turned to Drummond. "Counselor, do you have any additional evidence?" Drummond stood. "We do, Your Honor." He presented the promissory note from Gerald, the credit card statements from Stephanie, the loan documents from Diane. One by one, he laid out the pattern of financial exploitation that Grandma had endured from her own children. The courtroom went silent. Diane's face turned white. Gerald stared at the floor. Stephanie looked like she might be sick. The judge reviewed each document carefully. When she finally looked up, her expression was ice. "It appears to me," she said, "that Mrs. Castellano had very good reasons for structuring her will the way she did. The evidence shows a consistent pattern of financial responsibility on Mr. Castellano's part, and unfortunately, the opposite from the other parties involved." She closed the file. "The will is upheld. This case is dismissed." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Diane didn't look at me as she left. Neither did Gerald or Stephanie. They simply gathered their things and walked out in silence, their legal team trailing behind. I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. It was over. I had won. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Outside the courthouse, Drummond shook my hand. "You did well in there." "Thank you," I said. "For everything." He nodded. "What will you do now?" I thought about the investment portfolio. The house that would go to charity. The ring still sitting in the wooden box on my dresser. "I'm going to honor her wishes," I said. "All of them." And I did. Over the following months, I worked with the charities Grandma had named, ensuring the house was transferred properly, that her belongings went to the people and places she had specified. The scholarship fund she had established grew, helping students who, like me, didn't have family wealth to fall back on. The investment portfolio, I left mostly untouched. I took enough to pay off my student loans, to buy a modest house, to establish an emergency fund. The rest I reinvested, planning to use it the way Grandma would have wanted, carefully, purposefully, with an eye toward helping others. And the ring, I kept it. Not because of its value, but because every time I looked at it, I remembered the woman who wore it. Who taught me that wealth isn't measured in dollars. That family isn't defined by blood. That integrity is the only inheritance that truly matters. 6 months after the hearing, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Diane. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten. "I'm sorry." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Maybe one day I would respond. Maybe one day we could rebuild something from the wreckage. But for now, I had a different kind of work to do. The kind Grandma had prepared me for. Not managing an inheritance, but living a life worth inheriting. The weeks following the court decision felt like walking through fog. I woke up each morning half expecting to find out it had all been a dream, that Diane would be standing at my door with another lawsuit, another scheme, another reason why I didn't deserve what Grandma had given me. But the calls never came. The lawyers went silent. Even the occasional angry email from Stephanie dried up after the first month. What I got instead was something I hadn't anticipated. Silence from people I thought were friends. Neighbors who used to wave now looked the other way when I pulled into my driveway. Former coworkers stopped inviting me to happy hours. People I'd known for years suddenly acted like I carried some contagious disease called wealth, and they wanted no part of it. I tried not to let it bother me, but loneliness has a way of settling into your bones when you're not paying attention. I'd go entire weekends without speaking to another person beyond the cashier at the grocery store. My apartment, which had always felt cozy, started feeling more like a cell. Then one Saturday morning in late November, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter looking for a quote about family greed or inheritance drama. But something made me pick up. Marcus Castellano, a woman's voice said. Professional, clipped, the kind of tone that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. Speaking. My name is Victoria Chen. I'm a financial advisor specializing in estate management. Richard Drummond gave me your contact information. He thought you might benefit from professional guidance regarding your grandmother's portfolio. I sat down heavily on my couch, suddenly aware that I had no idea what I was doing. The money had been sitting in the investment account untouched except for the modest amounts I'd withdrawn. I'd been too afraid to look at it too closely, worried that somehow I'd make a mistake and lose everything Grandma had worked so hard to build. I could use some help, I admitted. Good. Because from what I've seen of the account, you're sitting on something that needs attention. Can you meet me Monday morning? 9 o'clock? I agreed, wrote down the address, and spent the rest of the weekend oscillating between anxiety and curiosity. Victoria's office was in a sleek downtown building, all glass and polished steel. She met me in the lobby herself, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a handshake that communicated both confidence and assessment. She led me up to the 14th floor, through a reception area decorated in minimalist elegance, and into a corner office with a view of the city that probably cost more than my annual salary. She gestured to a chair across from her desk and got straight to business. Your grandmother was smarter than most of my clients with decades more experience, she said, pulling up documents on her computer screen. She diversified beautifully. Conservative bonds, dividend stocks, some real estate investment trusts. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just steady, intelligent growth over 30 years. She turned the screen toward me. The number at the bottom made my throat tighten. It had grown since Drummond first mentioned it. Market gains, reinvested dividends, compound interest working its quiet magic. 3.4 million now, Victoria said. And if you leave it alone, manage it properly, it could easily double in 15 years. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across my shoulders like a heavy coat. What do I do with it? Victoria leaned back in her chair. That depends on what you want your life to look like. You could retire tomorrow if you wanted. Live modestly, travel, never work another day. Or you could use it to build something. Start a business. Fund projects you care about. Create generational wealth for a family you might have someday. I thought about Grandma's note. You know what really matters. I want to use it the way she would have, I said slowly. Carefully. For things that matter. Victoria smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her. Then let's build you a plan. Over the next 2 hours, she walked me through options. We set up a structured withdrawal plan that would give me a comfortable living income without depleting the principal. We identified charitable giving strategies that would honor Grandma's values while providing tax benefits. We discussed education funds, emergency reserves, long-term care insurance, all the boring, essential scaffolding that turns money into security. By the time I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Not over my family, not over the legal system, but over my own future. That sense of control lasted exactly 4 days. On Thursday evening, I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I froze in the hallway, heart hammering. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I always locked it. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find my place ransacked, electronics gone, drawers emptied. But everything looked normal. Nothing disturbed. Nothing missing. Then I saw it. Sitting on my kitchen counter, in the exact spot where I usually left my keys, was a photograph. It was old, the colors faded, the edges worn. It showed Grandma and Grandpa standing in front of a small storefront, arms around each other, both grinning like they'd just won the lottery. I recognized the location. It was the corner shop Grandpa had owned back in the 70s before he sold it and invested the money into the commercial property that had eventually funded Grandma's portfolio. I picked up the photo, turning it over. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were 3 words. Remember where it started. My hands started shaking. Someone had been in my home. Someone had left this here deliberately. But who? And why? I checked every room, every window, every lock. Nothing else was out of place. No signs of forced entry. No other messages. Just the photograph. I called the police. They sent an officer who took a report, dusted for prints, and told me what I already expected. Without signs of forced entry or theft, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I change my locks and consider a security system. After he left, I sat on my couch holding the photograph, trying to make sense of it. The message felt both threatening and nostalgic, like someone wanted me to remember something I'd forgotten or never knew in the first place. I called Drummond. He listened to the whole story, then went quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," he said finally, "have you considered that this might not be about intimidation?" "What do you mean?" "That photograph, the message. It doesn't sound like your aunt's style. She's direct, confrontational. This is subtle. Almost sentimental." "Then who?" "I don't know. But I think you should find out what that storefront means. Where it started. Maybe your grandmother was trying to tell you something beyond the will." I hung up and stared at the photograph until my vision blurred. The storefront address was visible on the awning. I pulled out my laptop and searched for it. The building still existed, though it had changed hands a dozen times since Grandpa sold it. Currently, it housed a bakery. I recognized the name. It was the same bakery Grandma used to take me to as a kid, where she'd buy me chocolate croissants and tell me stories about the old neighborhood. I hadn't been there in years. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove across town to the bakery. It was exactly as I remembered it, small and warm, smelling like butter and rising dough. The same elderly woman stood behind the counter, her hair grayer but her smile unchanged. "Marcus," she said, her face lighting up. "I haven't seen you since Helen's funeral. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, Mrs. Kowalski," I said. "I need to ask you something. Do you remember my grandfather? Vincent Castellano?" "Of course. He sold us this building back in '79. Best decision we ever made. Did my grandmother ever come here? Recently, I mean?" Mrs. Kowalski's expression softened. "Oh yes. Almost every week until she got too sick to travel. She'd sit right there," she pointed to a small table by the window, "and drink tea. Sometimes she'd write in a little notebook. She left it here once by accident, and I kept it safe for her, but she never came back for it." My pulse quickened. "Do you still have it?" She disappeared into the back room and returned a moment later with a slim leather journal, worn at the edges, held together with a rubber band. "I was going to mail it to her," Mrs. Kowalski said, handing it to me, "but then I heard she'd passed. I'm glad you came. I think she'd want you to have it." I thanked her, bought a croissant I didn't plan to eat, and sat down at the table by the window where Grandma used to sit. The journal was filled with her handwriting, entries dated over the course of the last 2 years. Most were mundane. Grocery lists. Appointments. Reminders to call friends. But scattered throughout were entries that made my chest tighten. March 14th, Diane called asking for money again. I said no. She hasn't spoken to me since. I wonder if she ever will. July 2nd. Gerald missed my birthday. 3rd year in a row. I'm not angry. Just sad. October 8th, Stephanie posted photos from Paris. She can afford trips like that but couldn't help with my prescriptions last month. I paid them myself. I always do. And then, near the end, an entry dated just 2 weeks before she signed the will. I've decided what to do with everything. It's not about punishment. It's about recognition. Marcus has been the only one who showed up when it wasn't convenient. Who sat with me when I was afraid. Who never asked for anything but gave me everything that mattered. Presence. Time. Love. The others will be angry. They'll fight. But they'll never understand that the greatest inheritance I could give them was the chance to be better. They didn't take it. So I'm giving everything to the one who already has what money can't buy. Character. I closed the journal, my eyes burning. The photograph, the break-in, it hadn't been a threat. Someone, maybe even someone Grandma had trusted, wanted me to find this. To understand that her decision wasn't impulsive or manipulated. It was deliberate, born from years of watching, waiting, hoping her family would prove her wrong. They never did. I left the bakery and drove to the cemetery. It was colder now, the trees bare, the ground hard with early frost. I walked up the hill to Grandma's grave, where the headstone had finally been placed. Simple, elegant, exactly what she would have wanted. I sat down on the grass beside it, the journal in my lap. I found it, I said aloud, feeling slightly ridiculous but not caring. I understand now. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around me. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice, warm and steady, telling me the same thing she always had. You're going to be fine, sweetheart. You've always been fine. I stayed there until the sun started to set, then drove home with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. But clarity, I was about to learn, doesn't mean the fight is over. 2 days later, I received a certified letter. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize, based out of Chicago. I opened it standing in my kitchen, already bracing for whatever new battle was coming. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was worse. The letter informed me that Gerald had filed a formal complaint with the state ethics board, claiming that I had violated fiduciary duty by accepting the inheritance while serving as Grandma's informal caretaker. He argued that I had a conflict of interest, that I should have disclosed the will's contents to the family, and that my failure to do so constituted elder abuse. The accusations were absurd, legally baseless, but that didn't matter. The ethics investigation would be public. My name would be dragged through the process. Even if I was cleared, the stain would remain. I called Drummond immediately. He was less concerned than I expected. This is desperation, he said. Gerald knows he lost in court, so he's trying to damage you another way. But the claim has no merit. You weren't a legal caretaker. You weren't a fiduciary. You were a grandson who helped his grandmother. But the investigation will go nowhere. Trust me. But it will take time. And yes, it will be unpleasant. He was right on both counts. Over the next 3 months, I was interviewed twice by investigators. They reviewed my financial records, my correspondence with Grandma, even my social media posts. They spoke to the hospice nurses, to Mrs. Kowalski, to Drummond. And in the end, just as Drummond predicted, they found nothing. The case was dismissed with a formal letter stating there was no evidence of wrongdoing. But Gerald had accomplished his goal. My reputation in certain circles was tarnished. People who didn't know the full story assumed there must have been something to the accusations. Why else would an investigation happen? I started to understand why Grandma had been so specific in her will. She knew they'd come after me. She knew they'd try to twist the narrative. And she'd prepared me as best she could. But there was one thing she hadn't prepared me for. In late February, nearly 4 months after the court ruling, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You deserve to know the truth." I hesitated before opening it, half expecting spam or another attack. But curiosity won. The email contained a single attachment. A scanned document. Legal paper, old and slightly yellowed. It was a birth certificate. Mine. Except it wasn't the version I'd grown up with. This one listed different parents. Not my mother and father, but Vincent and Helen Castellano. My hands went numb. I read it 3 times, then a 4th, trying to make sense of it. According to this document, I wasn't their grandson. I was their son. My mind raced through memories, searching for clues I'd missed. The way Grandma always seemed more protective of me than the others. The way Grandpa used to look at me with something deeper than grandfatherly affection. The strange gaps in family stories, the topics that were always deflected or changed. I called Drummond, my voice shaking. "I need you to verify something." He listened as I explained the email, the document. He was quiet for a long time. "Marcus," he said carefully, "I think you need to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting. Your grandmother came to me about 6 months before she passed. She asked me to hold something in trust. To give it to you only if you asked directly. She said you might never ask, and that would be okay. But if you did, I was to tell you the truth." My throat felt like it was closing. "What truth?" "You were born when Helen was 43. A surprise pregnancy that she and Vincent kept extremely private. Your mother, the woman you knew as your mother, was Helen's younger sister. She'd struggled with addiction, been in and out of rehab. When you were born, she wasn't stable enough to care for a child. So Helen and Vincent raised you as their own. Publicly, they said you were their daughter's son, their grandson. It was easier that way. Less judgment. Less gossip. I couldn't breathe. The woman I called Mom was your aunt," Drummond finished gently. "She died when you were 8. Helen and Vincent continued raising you, never correcting the story. They thought it would be easier for you. Less complicated." My vision blurred. All those years. All those moments. They weren't my grandparents. They were my parents. Why didn't they tell me? Drummond sighed. Helen said they were afraid. Afraid you'd feel lied to. Afraid it would change how you saw them. And as time went on, it became harder and harder to find the right moment. So they just never did. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for what felt like hours. Everything I thought I knew about my identity had just shifted. I wasn't the orphan grandson taken in by kind grandparents. I was the hidden son, the secret they'd carried for 33 years. And suddenly, the will made even more sense. Diane, Gerald, they weren't just my aunt and uncle. They were my half-siblings. And they'd treated me like I was less than, like I didn't belong, never knowing I actually had more claim to the family than they did. The cruelty of it was almost poetic. But what hurt more was the realization that Helen and Vincent had died without telling me. They'd left it to a lawyer, a document, a cold revelation in the aftermath of loss. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel betrayed. But instead, all I felt was grief. Deep, aching grief for the relationship we could have had if they'd trusted me with the truth. I spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions of work and life without really being present. I kept replaying memories, recontextualizing them through this new lens. Every hug felt different now. Every piece of advice carried new weight. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, I found myself back at the cemetery. I knelt beside the headstone, rain soaking through my jacket, and finally let myself cry. Not polite tears. Not quiet grief. But the kind of sobbing that comes from the center of your chest and doesn't stop until there's nothing left. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "I would have understood. I would have loved you the same." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Would I have felt differently, knowing they were my parents? Would it have changed the dynamic, added pressure, created expectations that weren't there when I thought they were just my grandparents? Maybe they'd been right to keep it hidden. Maybe the relationship we had was only possible because of the secret. Or maybe they'd just been scared, and fear had stolen years we could have spent in honesty. I'd never know. What I did know was this. I was their son. And everything they'd left me, the money, the responsibility, the fight, it wasn't just an inheritance. It was a legacy. A continuation of who they were and what they believed. And I wasn't going to waste it. I stood up slowly, wiping rain and tears from my face. The journal was still in my car. I retrieved it, opened it to a blank page near the back, and wrote a single sentence. "I'll make you proud. I promise." Then I closed it, placed it carefully beside the headstone, and walked back to my car. The rain was letting up. The sky was clearing. And for the first time since Grandma, since my mother, since Helen had died, I felt like I knew exactly what I needed to do. I drove straight to Victoria Chen's office. She was surprised to see me without an appointment, but she invited me in anyway. "I need to make some changes to the plan," I said. She pulled up my account, ready to take notes. "What kind of changes?" "I want to establish a foundation. Something permanent. For kids who grow up in complicated family situations. Foster care. Informal guardianships. The ones who fall through the cracks." Victoria's expression shifted, something like respect crossing her face. "That's a significant commitment." "I know. But it's what they would have wanted. And it's what I want." She nodded slowly. "Then let's build it." We spent hours mapping it out. The structure, the mission, the funding mechanisms. We discussed board members, legal frameworks, grant processes. By the time I left her office, the foundation had a name. The Vincent and Helen Legacy Fund. It wasn't about the money. It was about making sure other kids like me, had someone who showed up. Someone who cared. Someone who saw them not as a burden or a secret, but as worth fighting for. That night, I slept better than I had in months. But I should have known the peace wouldn't last. The foundation launched quietly in April. No press releases, no grand announcements, just a simple website and a mission statement that took me 3 weeks to write. We funded our first 3 grants by summer, helping kids aging out of foster care with housing deposits, job training, and college application fees. Small things that made enormous differences. Victoria handled the financial oversight. I handled the personal side, reading applications, conducting interviews, making decisions about who needed help and how much. Every story reminded me of my own, the confusion of not quite fitting anywhere, of being raised by people who loved you but couldn't quite tell you the whole truth. I threw myself into the work, grateful for the distraction. But avoiding my family forever wasn't realistic, and I knew it. The confrontation came in September, almost a full year after Grandma's funeral. I was leaving the foundation's newly leased office space when I found Diane waiting by my car. She looked older, thinner, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed at the edges. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I don't think we do." "Please." She held up her hands in something resembling surrender. "Just 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We walked to a nearby coffee shop and sat at a corner table far from other customers. Diane ordered nothing. She just folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Regret, maybe. Or exhaustion. "I know about the birth certificate," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. "How?" "Gerald hired someone to dig into the family records after the ethics complaint failed. He found it and showed me." She paused. "I've known for 3 months. And I've been trying to figure out what to say." She looked down at her hands. "We treated you terribly, Marcus. All of us. Even before we knew. Especially before we knew." I didn't respond. I wasn't going to make this easier for her. Mom and Dad, they never told us the truth either. "We genuinely thought you were our nephew. But that doesn't excuse how we acted." "How I acted?" "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." She flinched slightly but continued. "I was angry about the will because I thought it was unfair. But it wasn't unfair. It was honest. They gave their estate to their son. The one who actually cared about them. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Diane said. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. And I'm sorry. She stood, left a business card on the table, and walked out before I could respond. I sat there for a long time, staring at the card. It had her personal cell number written on the back in pen. I didn't call. But I didn't throw it away either. Stephanie reached out 2 weeks later via email. Hers was shorter, less eloquent, but somehow more genuine. I was jealous of you, she wrote. You had something with Grandma that I never figured out how to get. I blamed you for that instead of looking at myself. I'm working on that now. I hope you're doing okay. I replied with a single sentence. I hope you're doing okay too. Gerald never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Some people are built in a way that makes admitting fault impossible. But he did stop the attacks, stop the investigations, stop trying to destroy what I was building. That was enough. By December, the foundation had helped 43 young people. Some needed just a few $100s. Others needed mentorship, connections, someone to vouch for them when nobody else would. I met most of them personally. Heard their stories. Saw the same look in their eyes that I'd carried for years, the uncertainty of not knowing where you belonged or who you could trust. And every time I signed a check or wrote a letter of recommendation, I thought about Helen and Vincent. About the choice they'd made to raise me, to protect me, to give me a chance even when it meant carrying a secret that must have felt impossibly heavy. On Christmas Eve, I drove back to the cemetery. The foundation had its first major donor, a former foster kid who'd built a successful tech company and wanted to give back. We'd just funded a scholarship program that would help 20 students attend college next fall. I knelt beside the headstone, now weathered by a full year of seasons, and told them everything. I told them about the foundation, about the kids we were helping, about Diane's apology and Stephanie's email. I told them I understood why they'd kept the secret, even if I wished they hadn't. I told them I was using the emerald ring as collateral for a loan to expand the foundation's reach, something I knew they'd approve of. And I told them I was okay. Not perfect, not healed, but okay. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby trees. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out the hour. I stood, brushed the dirt from my knees, and placed a small pine wreath against the headstone. Simple, unpretentious, exactly what they would have chosen. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Saw the foundation's work online. Grandma would be proud. Stephanie. I smiled despite myself and replied. Thanks. Merry Christmas. The response came quickly. Merry Christmas, Marcus. I drove home through streets decorated with lights, feeling something close to peace. The inheritance had never been about money or rings or property. It had been about trust, about responsibility, about carrying forward the values of people who'd loved me enough to sacrifice their own comfort for mine. They'd given me everything that mattered. And now I was passing it on. The foundation continued to grow. By the second anniversary of Helen's death, we'd helped over 200 young people. We'd established partnerships with 3 universities, 2 job training programs, and a network of volunteer mentors who'd been through similar experiences. I still worked my accounting job, still lived in my modest house, still drove the same car. The money sat mostly untouched, working quietly in the background, generating returns that funded the foundation's expansion. And the emerald ring, I'd had it appraised properly. It was worth far more than the $200,000 Gerald had estimated. Close to $500,000, actually. But I didn't sell it. Instead, I had it placed in a museum exhibit about immigrant success stories, on loan indefinitely, with a plaque that read, Helen Castellano, 1947 to 2023. A woman who measured wealth in character, not currency. People visited the exhibit. They read her story. They learned about Vincent's small storefront, about the investment portfolio built on careful decisions and patient growth, about the grandson, really their son, who'd turned an inheritance into a legacy. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that funeral. About Diane demanding the ring. About Gerald checking his watch. About Stephanie staring at the casket with hungry eyes. They'd been so focused on what they thought they deserved that they'd missed what actually mattered. The quiet moments. The shared meals. The conversations that built trust over decades. I'd been given those moments. And in the end, they were worth more than any amount of money could measure. 3 years after Helen's death, I received one final surprise. A letter from a law firm in Boston, informing me that a distant relative had passed and left a small bequest. I opened the attached document with mild curiosity. It was from Vincent's brother, a man I'd met only twice in my life. He'd left me his entire collection of family photographs, letters, and documents dating back to the early 1900s. The accompanying note was brief. Your father would have wanted you to have these. You're the only one who'll appreciate what they mean. I spent weeks going through the boxes. Pictures of great-grandparents I'd never known. Letters written in Italian, translated laboriously with the help of a friend. Stories of immigration, struggle, survival. And buried in the middle of one box, a letter from Helen to Vincent, written shortly after I was born. In it, she described her fear, her uncertainty, her determination to give me the life her sister couldn't provide. She wrote about the judgment they'd faced, the whispers, the assumption that having a child at 43 meant something was wrong or scandalous. But she also wrote about joy. About holding me for the first time. About Vincent crying as he rocked me to sleep. About the decision to call themselves my grandparents publicly while being my parents privately, a compromise that protected me from questions they weren't ready to answer. We'll tell him someday, she'd written. When he's old enough to understand. When the time is right. The time had never come. Or maybe it had, and they'd simply been too afraid to seize it. I added the letter to the Foundation's archives, a reminder that families are complicated, that love doesn't always look the way we expect, and that inheritance comes in many forms. The last time I visited the cemetery was on what would have been Helen's 80th birthday. I brought flowers, the kind she used to grow in her garden. I sat beside the headstone and told her about the Foundation's latest project, a mentorship program pairing successful adults with kids aging out of the system. And I told her something I'd never said out loud before. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for being my mom, even when you couldn't say it. The words hung in the air, carried away by the same wind that had witnessed 1,000 other conversations between the living and the dead. I stood, placed the flowers carefully against the stone, and walked away without looking back. Because the inheritance wasn't behind me. It was ahead, in every life the Foundation touched, in every kid who got a second chance, in every person who learned that family isn't just about blood or names or legal documents. It's about who shows up. Who stays. Who loves you even when it's hard. Helen and Vincent had shown up. They'd stayed. They'd loved me through every difficulty, every secret, every sacrifice. And now it was my turn to do the same for others. The ring might have started the fight, but the will had ended it. And what I held now wasn't jewelry or money or property. It was purpose. And that, I'd learned, was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.